Alrighty, so what we're going to look at now is criterion B on both the higher level and the standard level psychology rubric. And this is for the method, but more specifically the part of the method called the design. And what we see up here is that the design, you need to have the following things. The independent variable and dependent variable are accurately identified and operationalized. The experimental design is appropriate to the aim, and its use is appropriately justified. And lastly, there is a clear indication and documentation of how ethical guidelines were followed. Now remember, this is word for word, the rubric, okay? So how do we get the full 2 points out of this rubric? Well, first of all, what we need to do is we need to identify and operationalize the independent and dependent variables, okay? So here's a couple examples for you. A good example is that the independent variable, this would be for the Stroop effect, the independent variable is the interference between the colors and the written words, okay, in our mind, the interference in our brain. So that's the thing that's causing the problem. A bad example would be that the independent variable was the color of the word, the color that the word was written in. Okay, so again, that's one of the contributing factors, but the actual independent variable is the interference between the color the word is written in and what the word actually says. Okay, now another example of a good dependent variable, this would be for anything, any kind of like levels of processing or something like that, a memory schema, anything like that, would be a good dependent variable operationalized would be the number of words they were able to recall and write down. Do you see how that is different from how much they remembered? How much what? Okay, this one right here is not operationalized, okay? And this one is also not complete, but obviously we've got some good ones bolded, okay? So that's the first thing we need to do. Now, the design, okay, in order to get the full 2 points for the design section, we need to just say which design we used and why we used it. So your sentence can be as simple as, we used an independent measures design because, or we used a repeated, actually that should say independent groups design, or you could say we used a repeated measures design because, and then say why you used it. Now remember, it depends on your specific experiment, but some of the popular ones for independent groups would be to avoid the practice effects or demand characteristics, right? Because if you have the same person taking a test twice, they could get better, which is practice effects, or they could start to guess the aim of the study, which would be demand characteristics. And obviously, when you choose repeated measures, you opted out of having 2 different groups tested, and maybe that's because you're testing something like people's people's ability to read a word written in certain colors. And obviously that would be something with Stroop. You know, you don't want participant variability being the reason why people had different times. You want the color of the words and the interference to be the reason why people have different times. So obviously you want to make it clear depending on what your thing is, okay? The next thing we want to look at are the controls. So what things did you do to try to avoid confounding variables, okay? Basically what they're looking for would be things like pre-screening students, you know, like not testing psychology students or not testing students who have already been tested again or something like that. And then also counterbalancing for primacy or recency effects or participant variability. Now again, if you have independent groups, you might counterbalance by having, you know, by splitting the 2 classes that you're doing into 2 mini groups. So you test someone in the morning, we test one class in the morning and one class in the afternoon. You don't want the timing to be a confounding variable, so you test half the morning group with one of the conditions and the other half the morning group with the other condition, and then do the same thing with your afternoon group. Same thing with primacy or recency. That could be with like a list of words. You basically want to make sure that the order of the words in a memory list isn't the reason, you know, people are just remembering the most recent words they saw. You obviously want it to be the level of processing that they're using or their schema or whatever. So obviously with different groups you might have a different order of the words, okay? And we'll check that off. And then lastly, we've got the mention of ethical considerations. So in order to get the full 2 points up here, remember, you need to have all ethical considerations mentioned. Now remember, here in the design, we mention them, and then in the procedure, you actually say which step, at what point in your procedure you incorporated each one of those ethical guidelines. So remember, usually all you really need is some mention of informed consent and referencing it, as well as some type of debriefing and anything else that you did. So an example would be all ethical guidelines were considered and all participants signed informed consent sheets. Right here, reference to appendix section where I can find a blank version of it. And we're thoroughly debriefed at the end of the experiment. Again, where can I find that script of what you said to them, the debrief, okay? Now, if you can manage to do all these 4 things, just like I said, then you can get a 2 out of 2 on your design.